December 13th, 2018 will please come to order. And first thing I want to do is welcome our two student representatives, and please introduce yourself and briefly tell us a little bit. So, Ms. Barnes.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. My name is Ann Barnes. I am a fourth-year PhD student in the College of Education and Human Development.
Thank you, and welcome, and Ms. Euland.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Cohen. I'm Allie Euland. I'm a senior at UMD, majoring in marketing and minoring in communication, and it's my second year as a student representative to the board.
Okay, well, I'm glad that both of you are here. And now we'll go right into our first item of the agenda, which is the external auditor report. So please come to the table, and we'll see. Ms. Glatt, you have some introductory comments? No. So then, is that correct? No. Correct. All right, and so we'll jump right in. I'm not sure which of you wants to start first.
Sure.
And please introduce yourselves.
Chair Cohen, committee members, good morning. Today, Katie Knutson and Mrs. Katie Knutson and Judy Dockendorf are here from Deloitte to provide the external audit report on the work completed to date, as well as the work that is continuing. So I will turn it over to them for their presentation.
Good morning, Chair Cohen and members of the committee. I'm Katie Knutson. For those of you that are new and is new to the committee, I am an audit partner at Deloitte & Touche, and I lead all of the work at the University of Minnesota. We've had excellent audit results this year, which Judy will go through in a minute. We're here today to present the results, as Sue indicated, results to date, and then we will be back in February for an update and going into our fiscal 2020 work. So thank you, or I guess 2019. I'm getting ahead of myself. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Dockendorf.
Right. Good morning, Chair Cohen and members of the committee. So our materials have been provided in advance, and I will move us forward to the audit scope, which is on page 5 of your materials. So our scope was outlined in our client service plan presented back in May to the committee, and there were no significant changes as we executed the audit work this year in our scope. Our audit procedures addressed the risks that we identified and presented to the committee earlier this year, and again, there were no significant changes as we moved through our materials. From a scope perspective, we've just outlined what work that entailed. So on the financial statement audits, that included the consolidated financial statements of the university, the statutory financial statements for Reminco. That's actually performed by a Deloitte Bermuda team, and that work was completed as Reminco's results are then consolidated into the overall results of the university. And that work was completed, and there were no issues there. And then we also have been engaged to do an audit for KUMD, the radio station on the Duluth campus. So that work will be starting here in December with an anticipated report issuance in January. So that will be something we report back to you in February when we're back with the committee. We also do a lot of compliance work, as Katie mentioned. So in the next set of bullets there, the first item is the Uniform Grant Guidance Audit. So this is the audit over the federal awards that the university receives. We actually issue opinions on the schedule of those expenditures itself, as well as internal controls over the programs that we've identified and tested. You do have a copy later on in your materials of the report that was issued in November there. And then we also do an examination for the state of Minnesota for state grants that students receive, and that was done and completed. We actually issued those reports yesterday. So that work has been completed, and there were no findings in any of the work there. So that's done actually for each campus. We issue a separate report for the 4 campuses and do a lot of work there in testing testing state grants that the students receive. And then we do some agreed upon procedures as well. So consistent with prior years, we do the NCAA agreed upon procedures for the Twin Cities campus. So these procedures are actually outlined for all universities by the NCAA, and we follow those. We make selections of revenue amounts and expenditure amounts and ensure that they're supporting documentation for those amounts. The Twin Cities report is in process. We actually are engaged this year to also do Duluth agreed upon procedures, so that is in process as well. And then the last bullet there, the Mayo Partnership in Regenerative Medicine, this is done every 2 years, covers a 2-year period of amounts that have been spent, and really is ensuring that those amounts were in compliance with the agreement with Mayo. So that's the scope of what we've done this year, with most of these being completed, but a few still to go. We'll move into some topics around the financial statement audit now. Obviously there's accounting estimates in the financial statements, and we focus on those estimates and judgments that management makes throughout our audit procedures. We are not aware of any significant changes in any judgments or estimates in the financial statements as compared to the prior year. So as we went through and either came up with independent estimates for testing those or looked at subsequent transactions, everything was satisfactory and in accordance with GAAP and the amounts that were recorded in the financial statements. We did identify as part of our audit plan 2 significant risks. The first one is highlighted on the bottom of this page here, which is management override of controls. This is a presumed fraud risk and significant risk for every audit. So it's not elevated at the university for any reason of anything we've identified, but it's, as part of our audit procedures, a presumed fraud risk and something we need to perform specific procedures over. So those procedures are highlighted here. We understand internal controls across the university, where those are in place around segregation of duties, the approval of transactions. We actually make a selection of journal entries and test any of those for management bias. We look at those management judgments and estimates. We hold fraud discussions with the committee, with various members of management. And then we also just step back and perform analytical procedures of the financial results themselves to make sure there isn't anything that doesn't look out of line. And if it is, we perform additional inquiries and make sure there's no management bias or override in any amounts that were recorded. And then the other significant risk we've identified, consistent with the prior year, is the valuation of alternative investments. This is the largest balance on the university's balance sheet. So here we're really working with the investment banking group to understand, who are they using from a investment manager perspective, what kind of investments is the university invested in. So we're really working to understand, what's out there from a population standpoint, and then how does the university record the valuation of those. We look at transactions near the balance sheet date. We send confirmations to those investment managers. We'll look at audited financial statements. So it's a variety of procedures we perform here to ensure that those amounts are appropriately recorded. And we noted no issues with this testing during the current year. The next slide highlights for you just one of the new accounting standards that was adopted by the university in this year's financial statements. It's GASB 75, relates to other post-retirement benefits, post-employment benefits. So the standard was issued, applicable for 2018, and the university actually then retroactively adopted it. So the impacts went back to the beginning of fiscal 16. This new guidance requires the university to do a full valuation of these liabilities on an annual basis, and also provided some additional guidance around discount rate selections and the fact that these annual valuations are required. So under previous guidance, you could actually do a valuation and then roll it forward for 3 years. Now you need to do a full valuation on an annual basis. So the university undertook, assessing the impact of this adoption and adopting it, in the financial statements. And also, while going through that, they went through the process of understanding an experience study around the population of participants in this plan and understanding at what point do we really think people are retiring. And as a result of the study, they actually noted that there are fewer participants retiring before the age of 65, and thus they are not eligible for these benefits. So in going through this process of not only adopting the new standard and looking at, the frequency of the valuations, they also looked at that underlying data and determined there really aren't as many participants as we originally thought that may be eligible for these benefits. And so that reduced the liability as well. So if you were to go to last year's financial statements, you would see some of those 2017 numbers don't agree anymore because this was retrospectively adopted. And then at the end of 2018, that liability is just under $35 million. So it's come down from around 110 million down to 35, primarily because of the updated assumptions around who actually would be eligible for these benefits. The next slide, we just wanted to provide some information on, some additional things just outside of the audit work. So highlighted here for you on the top left, just some events and meetings that various individuals have participated in. So several deans participated in our STEM Dean Summit that actually is down at Deloitte University in Dallas, Texas. For those of you who were here for the September meeting, Cole Clark came and did a presentation. We highlighted again the university relations program that Deloitte has from a recruiting perspective, and this is also noted in Appendix C, just the other schools that are in this program, but we're very proud to have the University of Minnesota in there from a core recruiting school that we recruit at Deloitte. So happy to again see the university in there. We highlighted for you on the top right, GASB 87. So this is another new accounting standard that will be applicable. This relates to leases. And if you were familiar with current GAAP, operating leases right now are not recorded on the balance sheet. So they just show up as you incur the expense on your statement of revenue and expenditures. Going forward, all of those operating leases will now come on to balance sheets and really increase your assets and increase your liability. So we're going to work with the university to kind of educate, understand what the university has around leases, what that population is, and then work through, understanding the adoption of GASB 87. It's a couple years down the road, but the education is needed now and the time to kind of really get our arms around what might be there. And then we just highlighted for you some trainings that various members really across the university, across different functions have attended various Deloitte webcasts on, taxes, internal auditing, the latest in, higher education comings and goings. So they're kind of, it's across the board, but we've had a number of University of Minnesota personnel attend those, and they are free. So we wanted to just highlight that. This summarizes some of the other services. So I've previously talked about most of this, maybe in the middle of the page around the Uniform Grant Guidance Audit. So this is that audit of federal dollars. Our testing here, similar to prior years, is really focused on the R&D cluster as well as the financial aid cluster. So you can see there that those two are making up about 900 million of the just over $1 billion in federal expenditures. So we perform testing of those programs. And then when we go through our actual scoping for the federal audit, we are required to understand any other programs that may need to be audited from a risk perspective. And so that's where we then brought in the two additional programs of USAID as well as Sea Grant support. So they're much smaller from a dollar value perspective in the grant dollars that they received, but they get audited on more of a rotation basis. And this audit went great. There were no issues noted. And as I mentioned, you have a copy of this audit report in your materials. These are just the other audits. So the first one is the OHE examination. So that was the state money that students receive, as well as the agreed upon procedures I talked about. And then in Appendix A, we just provided a snapshot of the statement of net position or your balance sheet, as well as the statement of revenue and expenditures and statement of cash flows for your information. But this is summarized basically from the financial statements themselves. And then our Appendix B just is our other required communications. Nothing that really I would point out here. We had great cooperation from Mike and Sue's team as we went throughout our procedures. No difficulties in getting any information that we needed. The one thing I would point you to is just slide 16 here of our materials, which is just corrected and uncorrected misstatements. So as the university was going through and finalizing their financial information for 2018, they had identified 2 items that actually related to the prior year that had been incorrectly recorded. those two items are noted here for you. And what I would say is that the university corrected those and that accounting treatment in the current year. And so that essentially overinflated our operating expenses on the current year. But at the end of 2018, our net position is correctly stated, and going forward, we should be good. But those were identified during the university's closing process, corrected, which just subsequently caused an uncorrected misstatement for the current period, but not material, but something that we are required to communicate to you. And then we just have a little overview of the university relations program with some of the schools that are part of that as well. But we would be happy to take questions you have on any of our materials or the audit work that we did.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dockendorf, for a really thorough report, and Ms. Knutson too. We really appreciate. We really appreciate such a strong audit, and I want to commend the Controller's Office and the Finance Department on being behind that and cooperating and helping us have a really strong audit. So thank you all very much. Now, if there are committee questions or comments. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Cohen, and I just want to echo the Chair's comments. I mean, no weaknesses, no deficiencies, no non-compliances. It was really clean, and so congratulations to the Controller's Office. Three quick ones. I'm just curious, for GASB 75, I mean, that was a big adjustment. Do we sort of, is there a median retirement age number that we calculate? I mean, I know, industries, I'm just wondering, so what is the median age at which people typically retire from the university?
So do you know? I don't know that off the top of my head.
It sounds like it's pretty close to 65, but I was just curious if you'd actually calculated that number.
We did. I don't know that detail
Okay.
off the top of my head.
I'm just curious. I mean, I know in industry it's like 61.1 or something, but it sounds like it's quite a bit. I mean, people wait. You're almost to 65,
Yes.
and so therefore we have very little retiring medical. Okay.
That is
liability.
correct.
Okay, then the other one is, in terms of risk areas, I mean, we do have a lot of cash exposure within, and do we see that, as a risk area, and is that an area of focus? I mean, tickets, and there's just all kinds of stuff for which it's cash transactions, and which I think is always an area of control risk, and I'm just wondering if there's a higher focus on that.
Chair Cohen, Regent Powell, very good question. We, when we think about risk, obviously the size of balances absolutely falls into our consideration. As part of our work, we certainly look at cash reconciliations that occur during the year, but from a heightened risk perspective, because of the robustness of that process, frankly, happens every single month, fairly straightforward. It's not something that we have as a higher risk, but certainly as we think about reconciliations and things like that would be within the scope of our work.
Okay. It might be a higher reputational risk than actually.
Yep. Yes, correct.
And then just the last one on the R&D auditing, which is, it's always impressive to leaf through. It's 100 pages of price. So how do we do a sample of all the grants, or do we do them all? And is that the audit, of all of that support from the federal government, which is almost $500 million for? This is the audit, and is it a sample? Do we do everything? And what actually do we look for when we, in terms of how we audit those grants?
Chair Cohen, Regent Powell. So we do a sample of those. We focus on some of the programs that get higher dollar values, so NSF, NIH, we're focusing there. But we're making a sample of expenditures that have been made and tracing them back to invoices and appropriate approval, and then also going to the grant agreement itself to say, based on the nature of this expense, is it actually appropriate under the grant agreement? And then we actually trace that all the way to the university submitting for reimbursement from the federal grant. So we make sure it's been expended first. It wasn't expended for an appropriate amount based on the grant, an appropriate expenditure. and then take that all the way forward to the university actually getting reimbursed by the federal program for that dollar amount. And we're in a range of, specific to R&D, between 60 and 100 selections across the program. So yeah, if you look at the report, there's a number of programs in R&D, and we try to cover them all. And, you know, year by year, we look at, what did we look at last year? Should we make some selections from other programs?
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. I think the first two will be pretty easy, but I'm wondering, so of the 82 people that had taken some sort of training from the Deloitte offerings, is that a high number compared to some of the other institutions that we compare ourselves to? And then secondly, I mean, do we know what their roles are at the university? Are they mainly coming from, you know, the audit team, or is it across the spectrum of the institution?
Chair Cohen, Regent Omari, I would say that an institution of your size, about 100 unique log-ons into what we call our debrief program would be average. I would also say that generally those individuals fall within finance and accounting and internal audit, because much of our offerings are very much financial, internal controls, items of those sorts. So that's generally, you know, who would attend, and who, frankly, if I look at sort of a cross section of all of my clients, that's generally who attend them. But the debriefs, registrations, you indicate your industry, your areas of expertise, whether it's in your role as an audit committee member, in your role as from a career perspective, and then you're notified, you know, via email to log into those webcasts that happen throughout every year, and quarterly notifications come out to those individuals.
Great, thank you. If I may.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. On the audit of the Minnesota State financial aid, what are we looking for in that audit, or looking at?
Yes, Chair Cohen, Regent Omari. So there's a guide that's issued by the state of Minnesota for all universities in the state to follow, and it will outline, based on the grant type, what types of things we need to look at. So, you know, was it valid that they received the money based on their income level? Did they graduate from high school? We're just validating a lot of the underlying information for those students that received the grants. But there's a robust 200 to 300 page guide that outlines by type of grant the procedures we would be performing.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chair Cohen, Regent Omari, I would just add one additional thing broadly to Regent Powell's question and yours. When you think of our compliance work, much of that is driven by documents that are 200 to 300 pages that lay out, you know, by grant agreement, by financial aid, what are the requirements of those agreements, what are the requirements in that financial aid funding, that a student, a researcher, what needs to happen, or how does that money need to be spent. So that's much of the work outside of our consolidated financial audit. That's what it's very much focused on.
I don't see any other questions from the committee, so thank you very much, Ms. Knudsen and Ms. Dockendorf, and also Ms. Paulson again. Thank you for your work and help, and for the finance and controllers departments for all the work you do for the university. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, our next item is our compliance initiatives, calculating the cost of compliance. And Mr. Coomer, our Chief Compliance Officer, will come forward and give us a report. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Quinn. Sorry, I wasn't going for dramatic pause or anything like that. I just anticipate coughing here. So thank you, Chair Cohen, committee members. In addition to the verbal information that I'm going to provide you today, I have also included the report of the Chief Compliance Officer for the Audit and Compliance Committee as a document in your board packet. This is a biannual report that provides updates and information related to the compliance program. And this report in particular includes a number of compliance risk review summaries as well as U-report statistics. You will also find in your documents the 2018 annual report of the Institutional Conflict of Interest Matters. Please review these documents at your convenience and feel free to contact me at any time if you have any questions or comments. So today my focus will be on presenting information and engaging in some discussion around two topics: the cost of compliance and efforts to develop an ethics component to the university's compliance program. I believe I will begin with assessing the cost of compliance presentation. So my objectives for this talk are first to eventually define in this presentation the cost of compliance, or at least this concept, the cost of compliance, to review the Vanderbilt University study titled The Cost of Federal Regulatory Compliance in Higher Education, a multi-institutional study, and then to share with you efforts that have been happening within the Office of Institutional Compliance for some time now to try to pin down the cost of compliance at the university, or at least give us some information and that we can use to decide if we want to do more or less in this area. So when you ask this question, what is the cost of compliance, to a compliance officer, the person you're asking may actually get a bit of a vertigo effect because this is a very broad question. And my mind can race through 1,000 possibilities as to what could be considered or not a compliance cost. Are we talking about all federal regulations, state, local regulations, our university policies and procedures? What about our contractual obligations? How about training and effort that goes in developing a culture of compliance within an institution, or the effort that is put into follow up on misconduct related to policies and procedures around these elements? So the cost of compliance is potentially a very broad question. So what is the desired level of precision, first of all, of the person who's asking this question? For example, if we're looking at salary costs related to any particular compliance issue, let's just leave that broad for now. Is it okay to generalize salaries by class of employees, or is the person asking the question, do they really want to know specifically the salaries involved for the people involved in that particular task related to that compliance effort? So those sort of questions need to be sorted out. Is accepting a respondent's best estimate acceptable, or do we need to do in-field observation and field work to determine the cost of compliance? And what are the perceived gray areas? And this is actually an area personally that I've struggled with for a long time related to the cost of compliance, because there's many things that you have to admit we would be doing anyway. One of my favorite examples is the use of fume hoods inside of laboratories. So we have these ventilation systems that pull away noxious gas so our researchers and lab workers don't get sick. Well, those are covered by federal regulations. We have OSHA regulations that require those. And if those regulations were to go away, we would still have fume hoods, right? Or we wouldn't have any scientists that wanted to work here in our labs. So struggling with those issues, and there's a lot of things that fall in those categories. And then also there's a challenge with assets that are used for multiple compliance functions, or compliance and non-compliance functions. And this kind of comes down to that precision level, but how do we tease out that information, and what's an acceptable level of effort to put into that? So the Vanderbilt study, and I'm very thankful for this study, and somebody asked me recently if this was a good study on the cost of compliance in higher education, and the reply is it's really the only study that we have. So it's what we're working with, but it does answer a lot of those, or at least gives you a way to address a lot of those difficult questions that I've just mentioned. So the objective was to conduct a comprehensive estimate of the true cost of federal regulatory compliance across post-secondary institutions, as well as to estimate the cost of federal regulation to the entire U.S. education sector based on extrapolation of the sample institutions. So some big goals here for this. It was carried out in 2 phases, just a little bit of background. Phase 1 was to categorize federal regulations that impact Vanderbilt and estimate the annual cost burden of these regulations on Vanderbilt. Phase 2 was to identify some participating institutions, collect data across all those relevant regulatory areas at each of those institutions, and then estimate the cost of compliance burden at those institutions, and then perform the preliminary sector extrapolation. So the participating institutions are here, and as you can see, there's a mix of research, non-research, public, private. So, but I am grateful for the work that each of them did because it does turn out to be helpful. So the definition of regulatory areas is used in this study. So we have research. Are those areas specific to research, regulatory areas specific to research? Federal grants or contracts management as an example, human subjects research, et cetera. Higher ed, another category they look at here. Regulatory areas specific to higher education, but that you're not going to see in the research section. And things like that would include, FERPA is a great example, financial aid, and then all sectors. So, and it's just what the name implies. It's not specific to higher education at all, things that any business would really run into. So anti-discrimination, immigration, certain safety regulations outside of those found just in research. And then the types of costs considered include labor. Pretty self-explanatory, non-labor operating costs, which could include the cost of outsourcing some of those labor items, and then the indirect cost of labor as well. And so you think about those things that just having, in order to have a workforce that you need to have in place, such as your infrastructure. So then we get to the question of scope. Again, only looking at federal regulatory compliance and only if one of the following criteria was met. So this helps narrow it down even more in terms of what they looked at in this study. Because again, this could get very, very, very big very quickly. So risk of violation or penalties under U.S. federal law. And then any work or effort that went into determining whether or not a particular activity fit one of those categories. So, and that helps. And then conveniently, they also provide a list of exactly the areas that they looked into. So again, great resource. So again, the three areas, research, higher ed, and all sector, and then the regs or the category of regs that were examined. So this next section I find very, very interesting, very useful as well, and are the tools of estimation. So how did they get the information they were looking at? And again, we're looking at the level of precision that they wanted to glean from the answers. So central and administrative compliance cost that was teased out through use of worksheets and interviews. And also by taking employee salary and benefit data. And in some cases, it seemed, just reading into the study a bit, that actual salary cost was used in many cases here. But then when we looked at decentralized cost, same worksheet interview process and some survey processes where sampling was a better way to go about. And also using employee salary and benefit data to kind of extrapolate the cost for those broad compliance initiatives. How did they answer some of those gray areas that we talked about earlier? So the perceived gray areas anyway. So Vanderbilt addressed the question about whether or not an activity would be performed anyway, the one that I've personally struggled with, by saying, look, if it's covered by any of those federal regulations, whether or not we would do it anyway, we're just going to throw it into the cost of compliance. We're just going to include it instead of trying to tease out, you know, what percentage of that activity would we do anyway. We're just going to count it. Costs considered to be mutually exclusive and could not fulfill multiple regulatory requirements. So that question about if you have something where it's a cost of compliance and maybe it covers a couple different compliance topics, or maybe it covers compliance and non-compliance. They took the, I think, cost-saving approach of allowing the institution to decide what the appropriate allocation would be if it were multiple compliance topics, or if it was covering one compliance area they felt more than others, then just allocating the entire cost to that one area. But what they did not allow was for any one particular cost to be credited or laid on more than one compliance topic. So, all right, so all of that dry material gets us to the summary of the results across all of these 13 institutions. I think this is a slide that you're probably going to find one of the most interesting. So the federal regulatory compliance burden ranged from 3 to 11%, with a median of 6.4% of annual operating expenditures. Research-related costs, as you can imagine, were higher, from 11 to 25% of research-related expenditures. Higher ed and all sector was considerably lower, from 2 to 8% of each institutional's non-research expenditures. And I think the last two bullet points are very interesting too. The overall cost of compliance tends to be driven by whether or not the institution has, or the extent to which the institution conducts research. But you have to keep in mind that the impact of scale was an important factor as well. So that economies of scale did apply. Institutions with relatively high non-research expenditures tend to experience lower regulatory burdens converging near that 2%. And it was really as a percentage of their overall expenditures. So institutions where research expenditures were in the 50% range of overall expenditures, they had a much higher overall cost of compliance versus those that were more in the 10% range. And then their sector-wide extrapolation found, and essentially just taking those numbers and then information from the Higher Education Research and Development Survey and the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, and found that the annual cost, and this would have been in 2014 data, 13-14, $27 billion is spent annually in higher education on compliance with those federal regulatory topics. $17 billion was due to the higher ed and all sector related compliance, and $10 billion due to research related compliance. So I am going to now talk about our university's efforts related to the cost of compliance. Do you have any questions about the study and that information?
Are there any questions about the general information so on?
Well,
yes, Regent Hsu.
thank you, Chair Cohen. Were we invited to participate in this study?
As far as I know, we were not, but I was not here at the time. But as far as I know, we were not.
All right, we'll move on to our specifics, and then I'm sure there'll be some questions.
Thank you. So our efforts. The compliance risk review process, which is actually something I've had the opportunity to brief this committee on before, and in May I will give an extensive dive into the compliance risk review process. But this is where we have been incorporating our effort to assess the cost of compliance. So just a quick overview of the compliance risk assessment process. As one of the elements of an effective compliance program, as laid out by the federal sentencing guidelines, the Office of Institutional Compliance for the Compliance Program has a responsibility to monitor the compliance efforts taking place in the university and report that information to senior leadership. Our tool or method for doing that at this institution is a compliance risk review process, which is a collaborative process that works with the compliance stakeholders, develops assessment tools, and takes a very consistent approach across the institution is the best term to how we assess compliance efforts and look for compliance gaps. So with that process, we have incorporated the cost of compliance questions into an assessment tool. So when we go into an area and we look topic by topic, so for example, if we're looking at environmental health and safety, and specifically lab safety, teasing out the number of EHS employees that focus their time and effort on lab safety. The cost to the institution for the estimated cost for training, for example, as it relates to lab safety. That's the kind of information that we've incorporated into our regular assessment, but we're taking it on an area by area basis. This information then is reported to the Executive Oversight Compliance Committee, and over the past year, that group, as well as the Office of Institutional Compliance through our own continuous quality improvement program, have been working to refine those questions and procedures for pulling out that information. Any questions?
Right. Committee members, any questions?
And if you don't have a question, I think my question for the committee, because this question of cost of compliance has come up quite a bit, is the efforts, if the efforts of the Office of Institutional Compliance to tease out the cost of compliance through the CRR process are somewhat in alignment with what we've gone into detail over with the Vanderbilt study, is that satisfactory? Because the question tends to come from this committee. Is that what you'd want to see?
Regent Omari.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Cohen. Thank you for this presentation. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Regent Emeritus Broad as we have this conversation, because she was consistently asking and wondering about the cost of compliance. I'm not going to answer your question because I don't know the answer to it. I'm still processing that. But okay. I guess, so as I look at this and I think about it, I think about how we can use this information, and then I'll pose the question to you, how do you think we should use it afterwards? But, I think about it, one, in terms of the Vanderbilt study and the numerous institutions that participated to start to tell a story, right? Whether that's at the federal government or elsewhere, kind of one bucket is to use that to talk to the federal government and say, look, here's how this is impacting us, here's what we're putting back in, so on and so forth, and try to make some policy change at that level. The second area that I look at it is very much in conjunction with our finance office, when we're telling the story of, yes, here's our total budget, here's our total research budget, but then in addition to this research budget, here's actually how much money we have to do this, that, and the other, right? To start to paint a more wholesome and understandable budget for the general public and for the institution to really be able to see and look at and levers and that type of thing. So that's how I'm thinking about it. And then I would ask you the question, how do you see us using this information once we are able to start putting some numbers and dollars behind it?
So looking for those efficiencies of scale is always helpful. But when we have regulatory costs, and if we look at those federal regulations, they are more or less not optional. So we can only try to make our process more efficient. In developing a culture of compliance in an institution, and if you're looking at it holistically, cost is part of that, but if we're always asking the question, what is the cost of compliance? What is the cost of compliance? I think those individuals who are responsible for compliance on a day-to-day basis may lose sight of the fact that in the end, in order to do the right thing, it's really about culture and putting that mentality first, and then everything else should follow. Does that?
Yes, if I may, Chair Cohen. Sure. Yes, it does make perfect sense. I guess what I'm trying to, maybe I'm getting at more of a technical and not adaptive, right? So sure. I'm looking less at the culture, which I fully agree with everything that you're saying. And going more towards the storytelling piece of it, of here, from a technical standpoint, here's how much we pay to do research, if you will, right? Right. And so am I articulating that or thinking of it in a way that is accurate, that is a way that we can and should be using what we find from something like this? And if not, that's fine too. Let me know.
I don't know, and with all due respect, Regent Omari, I don't know if that's really my question to answer. With my focus being on the culture of the institution and perhaps the board and the work that the board does being more towards the overall well-being of the institution, the overall operations of the institution. So I know from my point of view, while I think cost is an important factor and you need to understand it and the holistic approach to compliance, our first message always has to be about culture and doing the right thing. And there are so many nuances to this. One example that was pointed out to me is if we're assessing the cost of compliance, and this was somebody who was, the question can sometimes concern individuals. And if you're looking at one particular topic and you have area A and area B, it's not like we're always comparing apples to apples. Sometimes it is definitely apples to oranges. And area B maybe has an employee who's well situated at the appropriate level to handle this, whatever the task is, and spends a certain amount of time on that task. Area A doesn't have that same capacity with that employee, but they have a higher level employee, and by higher level I mean maybe even better paid employee who is willing to take on that extra work. And so if we were to look at the cost of getting that work done here and getting the work done in this other area, area B would seem like it was more cost effective. But what it wouldn't reflect is that area A didn't hire that extra person just to do that additional work. They were operating very, very lean. So it's from my point of view, with every time we run through a cost of compliance scenario or situation, we have to assess all of those different factors that come into play. So,
thank you,
sir.
All right. The next person who wants to talk has a question, Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Cohen, and thank you, Mr. Coomer, for the presentation. I'll take a very high level and perhaps inarticulate stab at your question, but the culture has to be right. We have to comply, and getting the culture right has to start with us. So I look at and read and listen with interest this kind of a conversation, and I hope that you find the value in it to be of two types. One is, how effective are we at assuring the culture is right? How do we constantly look for best practices? So the Vanderbilt study looks to me like a way that you further educate yourself, bring the expertise into the organization, and then help disperse it from us to the president and on down, that the culture is not optional. It has to get right, and it is, I think, largely right. But the second piece you were getting close to with Regional Mari, I think, and that is, once we think we have the culture right, then how do we bring scale and process and systems and all those things to our advantage in managing the costs of compliance? And again, I think enlightening that with best practice work in places like, Vanderbilt, that's what you're here for. And I just don't think you can ever get the two too mixed up, though. The culture has to be right, and whatever the cost of having the culture right, it is. And then once we're satisfied the culture's okay, I think then it's a different level of dialogue and a different level of conversation with the board and from the president down about how can we really advantage ourselves in one of these areas where the cost from a doing business standpoint is potentially disruptive to the strategy. It's a big enough number that, if you don't have those advantages, those systems, those processes, those people and scale, it could, change our business plan going forward, not our business plan, but our vision and what we want to do. And I think we've got all those advantages, scale being number one, but there's no better place to work than to look for best practices and what are your colleagues doing, bigger and smaller than us. So thank you. I appreciate it. And I don't look for a degree of technical precision or accuracy out of this. I look for how's the organization responding to you as you go out and bring a message of culture and process improvement.
Now, thank you, Regent McMillan, for the question and those comments. To the cost of compliance piece, and this thought came to mind, and also perhaps in a little more towards the way of also answering Regent Omari's question. I think one of the advantages to adding the cost of compliance questions to the compliance risk review process is that they will be reviewed consistently by the Executive Oversight Compliance Committee, which is information that prior to having the compliance risk review process in place and the cost of compliance work that was being done, that this group wouldn't be regularly exposed to. And so I think that is really a benefit. So and as we become more mature in our understanding of the cost of compliance, if we see large outliers, this group can address them. As to the culture piece, I came to this institution because, in part, the compliance program is so well known. I'm very proud to actually be in the role that I'm in. We have a very, very strong compliance partner network that take compliance very, very seriously. And I seldom, if ever, have a problem where if I'm talking to one of those compliance partners about an issue, I meet any resistance. So I think that is a fantastic element of this job. I do think that there's work to be done, though, on the culture, and this actually is a nice segue into the next presentation about developing an ethics component to the compliance program. There's definitely work to be done. People here want to do the right thing. And work very hard to do the right thing, but I think having some guiding principles in place would be a benefit.
All right, thank you. We have two more regents who want to ask questions on this topic, and then maybe that was a good segue into moving into our ethics shortly. So Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. Thank you, Mr. Kumar, for the presentation. I like where this is headed. I like the fact that you found a study that could help us in this area. Obviously, we have to get the culture right. I like the continuous improvement aspect of this. But I'd like to kind of ask you some questions. I don't know I actually forgot what your question was. Otherwise, I'd try and answer it. But I can do that again if we have time. But you've identified, I guess through this Vanderbilt study, that in 2013 and 14, $27 billion was spent on compliance sector-wide. And I was wondering, have you done any work to figure out how much of the $27 billion we represent there are various methods you can do that based on, how much we spend on, research compared to the total in the U.S. or whatever the sector is. And then also, is there a way to go down into all of these other regulatory categories on page 126? Some of them are easier than others to work on, but for example, the Clery Act, I think that's a pretty simple one. We can pretty much determine how much effort we spend in terms of labor or non-labor, all those types of factors in terms of complying with the Clery Act. And some of these other ones, I think, are maybe pretty easy to do as well. But is that part of your question? Does it? I think it would be valuable to kind of know how much we're spending on these various areas, and then kind of know what our total would be, just to kind of give us a ballpark figure of what we're spending on compliance.
Well, thank you, Regent Hsu. And in a way that is in alignment with the question that I asked. Would our process of assessing the cost of compliance through the compliance risk review process satisfy those that have asked this question? So to the cost of compliance at the university, and have we done any work to kind of tease that out from this study, what it may look like here? I can tell you what other institutions have done. They have taken that 6.4% median number and adjusted it through either some estimation one way or the other, if they felt that because of their economies of scale or their lack of research, they went more towards the 2%, or they were higher on the scale, and then took their annual expenditures and came out with a number. I would leave that to, I think, our finance experts here at the institution, because that would be a big number, right? If we were to tease that out. So I think I would leave that to the experts in finance to do it that way. The way that I'm proposing is more is a slower process. It doesn't give us that big number right away, but it says as the compliance office goes into each of these areas to assess the compliance program structure around those topics, around Clery, around lab safety, et cetera, that we will also work on pulling out the cost of compliance for the institution. But it will be done, there's a cost, right? It's kind of ironic. We're looking at the cost of compliance, but just assessing the cost of compliance adds a cost to compliance. And so we have an existing process where it's easy to add these questions and these steps. I think it's a very efficient and lean way to do it, versus the alternative of just sort of putting together an initiative or a project and just trying to sweep through the entire institution. I think our way is more cost effective, and I think it's sustainable because the compliance risk review process is cyclical. So we'll get the number now, and then in 3 to 5 years when we come back to an area, we'll have a new number, and we'll be able to gauge whether we're becoming leaner in that area, staying the same, or if things have gotten more expensive. Whereas I think that one-time crash through isn't necessarily going to get you. So.
Right. And before I call on Regent Powell, I will call on Auditor Clapp. Or do you want, okay, Regent Powell first and then Auditor Clapp.
Thank you, Chair Cohen, and thank you, Mr. Coomer, for the presentation. So I just found myself thinking of it as you went through it, and I thought about this. And by the way, thank you for bringing us the study, because I do think it's thought-provoking. It seems to me like a lot of it's all compliance, but for me, much of the compliance is about safety. And which is actually a risk, factor that we've identified. So we think places got to be safe. And so when you talk about human subjects and animals and dealing with toxic substances or dangerous organisms, I mean, we have to do what we have to do. If we have to have a level 4 whatever they are, biohazard. We have to, and we all want to do everything we need to do to reduce that risk and manage it as low as possible. So I think of it in part as cost of safety, and I think you alluded to that in your remarks. We're going to do that anyway. We're not going to argue. Then I think I'll sort of probably echo what many other regents have said, which is, what to do with this. I think it then comes down to for the more administrative component, how do we do it in the highest quality way, but with the lowest possible cost? And are we overly decentralized? Can we set up centers of excellence, presumably under your direction, that, where we really gain expertise and scale that allows us to operate really efficiently? Because it is, to Regent Shu's question, whether it's 6% or 3%, it's a big number. It's going to be tens of millions of dollars, that we spend here. And so it becomes, I think, kind of a management question of, can we do this? Are there smarter, better ways to do this, while still, achieving what we need to achieve?
Yeah. Thank you, Regent Powell, for the question. And again, through this compliance risk review process and adding this as a component, I think over time, those are where the efficiencies can be detected. First of all, I think I use the term maturity, but there's a a learning process that takes place for even the EOCC, for myself. As we go from one area to the next, there are lessons learned. Oh, there are similar compliance challenges, and one area handles it this way, another area handles it this way, and this way seems more efficient. So maybe we need to look at the possibility of streamlining or providing that information to that other area so they can streamline. The question as to centers of excellence, I think the institution is although we're not calling it that, I think we're moving towards some efficiencies in compliance in areas that are inherently very expensive. One of which is training. So we've moved our employee training and education system recently from a vendor product to a homegrown product, and I give my colleagues in IT and Bernie Glachek and HR folks a lot of credit for all the effort they put into this. But now we have a training hub system here at the university that is really, really cost effective. Extremely so compared to what we had before, and in my opinion, much better. We have our own governance committee set up around it now, much more control over those processes. And so the next step is to look at compliance training in general across the institution. And I am never going to be the person who's giving radiology safety training. I mean, we're going to need those subject matter experts to own those topics. But what we can do is we can streamline the process for them creating their content, delivering their content, tracking their content. So there are lots of ways that we can become more efficient and have, I would say, more of a collaborative effort without necessarily pulling everything into what we would typically call centralized. So, thank you.
All right, Chief Auditor Klatt, the last word on this subject as we move into ethics.
Oh, I don't know about last word, but
some thoughts.
Some thoughts, yes, retrospective thoughts. So, as Mr. Kumar started, the topic of the cost of compliance has been raised at this committee for several years. And answering that question, as Boyd has laid out, is a multi-level proposition. You can take several avenues to do that, and each of those avenues requires a wide variance in the amount of effort and cost to do that. And the administration wants to be very responsive to the question, to answer the question that Regents have asked, but knowing kind of to what end is important to know how much institutional resources ought to be devoted to answering the question. So if, as Regent Omari suggested, one of the uses of this is to have have a public story, perhaps use and leveraging of studies like Vanderbilt is sufficient to say this is the range of research universities, and as Boyd said, many have recalibrated that to get in that range better, thinking about their own institution. We certainly are large enough to have benefits of economy of scale and things like that. So is that enough to provide the information Regents want to tell that public story? And then if it's how is the institution, the University of Minnesota specifically, identifying cost of compliance to use the risk assessment process that the Office of Institutional Compliance is utilizing? Again, as Boyd said, a longer horizon to get all the information to consolidate into that. But it is a activity that's ongoing, and so we would do it anyway. So it's not additional cost.
Correct.
But if the expectation is for us to replicate something like Vanderbilt, to go out and actually quantify the cost of compliance within the institution of University of Minnesota, everyone has to realize that is a immensely intensive exercise from a cost and resources. And again, to what end would we do that? And then the other piece is, as Regent Hsu was brought up, is really our interest in not what the cost of compliance is. To me, I could use the Vanderbilt number and get in a ballpark and be comfortable with that. But how are we managing and trying to improve our cost of compliance through being efficient and continuous improvement, and using the information that comes out of the risk assessments to, as Boyd said, lay areas against each other to say, are there best practices here that we could leverage to better manage what we're investing in that cost of compliance? So, I think some direction about the level of detail and, what does this committee want to be that next step is helpful.
All right, well, in just a couple minutes, my sense of the committee, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because is that our expectation is not replication for the University of Minnesota of the Vanderbilt study specifically for us, that would be a very expensive endeavor, and perhaps the road that you suggested, Mr. Coomer, of as you're doing some of the compliance assessments, you're looking at what could be more efficient, what is best practice, and so on, and that sort of as a rotating basis and part of the work that you do anyway is probably what the committee would recommend. Am I summarizing correctly or not? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. I would say that before we dismiss kind of that direction, I'd like to know what the cost of that would be. So if we could get an estimate that says, hey, we could spend $25 million to replicate the Vanderbilt study, then we could react to that and say, yeah, that's too much. But if it's, a couple $100,000, I think it would be reasonable for us to say, let's replicate this and actually get to the bottom of it. Because if we can't measure this stuff, then, our only way of addressing this topic is just to say, well, we haven't had an incident in 2 years. That's pretty darn good, and let's just keep going and hope that nothing comes up. Whereas if something comes up, like the human participant research issue that came up in 2014-15, we don't even know what the actual cost of that to the organization was. We know how much we spent in trying to deal with it, but in terms of brand, the cost to our brand and in other areas, and potentially even in whether or not some of our funding was at risk because of that. We don't know the answers to that. So I guess until someone says, hey, look, this Vanderbilt thing, here's our proposal for it, it's X dollars, I don't know that we can really answer that question. So.
All right, well, perhaps we should see if there's a somewhat of a cost-effective way of estimating that. It could be another additional fairly significant cost, and table this discussion, continue in February, and see what the committee's direction is. All right, okay. All right, Mr. Coomer, you have about 10 to 15 minutes for some ethics.
Okay, well, thank you, Chair Cohen. Thank you, Quinn. So my objective for this next presentation, my objectives are to provide a background to this committee on the history to date regarding the addition of an ethics and a component to the compliance program, and then to talk about the next steps, because some work has been done in this area. So where we are now and what we will be doing in the future. And I also hope to get the committee's feedback as well. So background. In May 2016, a report to the University of Minnesota president was issued titled Institutional Compliance Function Review. This report was created on charge from the president, at the request of the president, by a small work group that included our internal auditor, the general counsel, and the president's chief of staff. The work group reviewed the Office of Institutional Compliance current procedures and identified best practices by consulting with internal and external stakeholders in compliance and subject matter experts as well. The work group found that the existing compliance program at the university was largely effective and made recommendations to strengthen our ethical culture, better track compliance training, and clarify roles and accountability, and elevate the compliance director's roles. So there were 6 categories of recommendations for the Office of Institutional Compliance, and you can see that the second one was to develop a university ethics program, or programming around university ethics. And that's what we'll focus on for this presentation. It was found that the university is an outlier among our peers in not having any formal institutional programming around ethics, and recommended that the university should establish a new ethics program within the Office of Institutional Compliance, and tasked with reinforcing an ethical culture, and create new programming, and further define the scope and core activities of the program should be among my first responsibilities. And let me assure you, I started this work almost immediately after getting here. But this is also a big topic to chew on, and something that we want to make sure that we do it right. So in defining the scope and core activities, and this is where a lot of the work went in. In 2017, we developed an ethics program framework, and we did this through a lot of internal discussions with the president, the chair of the Audit and Compliance Committee of the Board of Regents. That was Chair Brode early on in this process. The general counsel, the AVP of internal audit, the president's chief of staff, and the executive oversight compliance committee. Externally, we held discussions with peers and compliance organizations, including the Minnesota Chief Compliance Officer Network, of which I am a member, the Big Ten Chief Compliance Officer Network, the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, and then we made cold calls, if you will, to universities that had what we saw as solid-looking ethics programs within their compliance programs. And then a review of literature was performed. We utilized university resources, such as a review of past documentation, policies, procedures, university statements on guiding principles and values, as well as looked at external publications on the topics of institutional compliance programming. So in March of 2018, we obtained a charge from the Executive Oversight Compliance Committee to establish a university's ethics program, and this is where the framework comes in. The components to be implemented include defining ethics as behaving in a manner consistent with our values, and that's actually a question that would sometimes trip up other compliance and ethics professionals. If you ask them, well, how does your program define ethics? You get a bit of a pause. And we thought it was very important to be able to, if we're going to use the term ethics, to be able to define it. Identify and define 4 to 5 core values that can guide ethical decision-making and ethical behavior. So this work is in progress, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then promote the core values through employee training, messaging, so forth. Assess and monitor our ethical culture, and establish an Office of Institutional Compliance and Ethics as a university resource center. So in identifying the 4 to 5 core values, again, in consultation with university stakeholders, including faculty and staff, we have spoken with leadership from the faculty, P&A, and civil service consultative committees, and we are going before those committees in January and February to get their feedback on core values, on these 4 to 5 core values. I've had discussion individually with many members of the president's senior leadership team, but they will also be given an opportunity to weigh in on what should be 4 or 5 core institutional values for the ethics program. And then the plan is to conduct a system-wide survey or comment process to weigh in on these values as well. And then the next steps would be to establish the Office of Institutional Compliance as a university resource. And when I see applying, actually applying this, it's when we have identified those core values, being able to take them forward and present training where employees, leadership can learn a decision-making process that incorporates those values as well. So this values-based decision-making is a big part of it. Also, it's something that could become a component, for example, of our policy review process, and looking at our core values and how the policy process or the policy supports those values. And then promote the core values, develop and implement the awareness campaign and training for leadership and so forth. So, and then the next steps, I'm sorry, my slides haven't been keeping up with me. In the next steps, 2020 and beyond, the Office of Institutional Compliance and Ethics would maintain itself as a resource on the subject of ethics and continue to promote those core values. And then in partnership with the appropriate university colleagues, develop and implement a process and procedures for assessing and monitoring the culture of ethics within the institution. And again, those core values can be central to how that work is done.
Well, thank you for the presentation and all the work. And now comments from the committee members. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. Thank you again for that brief presentation. I actually get a little bit nervous when we start talking about values, because we always talk about values, and everybody's got different, in terms of their part of the institution, different values. And once I asked the question, I said, oh yeah, our values are well defined and you can find them right here. Well, nobody's using these over here that they point to, and so when you're talking about developing new values, I get a little bit nervous because we talk about values every day, yet nobody seems to be able to define them. I think we had a conversation just a couple months ago about this exact topic in a different committee. And so I'm interested to know, how we're going to address this. I just did a quick Google search on the values University of Minnesota, and the School of Public Health comes up. They have theirs. And there's College of Liberal Arts, they have theirs. So I'm just saying that I think we need to kind of get a grip on this because, if you turn to athletics, they have their own values. And, when we talk about it, we should be referring to the same thing. And I don't know that we need to, have another set of values coming out of this committee, but yet, the institution as a whole needs to kind of have the values, list of values or value statement that we all get around.
Thank you. Regent Powell.
Over there. Thank you. Thanks, Chair Cohen. So I think this is actually a real opportunity for us, and the reason I think that is in part for many of the points that Regent Hsu just made. I do think we have lots of things out there. We also have lots of policies. We have codes of we have lots of. It's all. I understand that it's important, but my view, and it stems from my experience, is that having a very concise statement of core values of the institution, it can be really powerful. And to the point of, so what are they? Which I also thought was a good point. I think that you probably have to look historically and look across the institution. I think that themes, would emerge where you could sort of say, there's some things that we've really stood for. And I think that, if we can get it down, really concise, 5 of them, that we can all rally, it really helps. And so I'm very supportive. The only other comment I would make is I do think that it's something that ought to be led by the senior leadership of the institution, which is what you say. But somehow, the board has to say, we have to have a role in this somewhere. We've got to be able to endorse it as part of the process. So anyway, I think it's a good initiative, and it is an opportunity.
Student Representative Yulin.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think my hope, and a lot of students' hope, coming out of this set of values that the university holds, I think that would help with consistency, because it can get a bit confusing when your individual collegiate unit has values. If you're a double major, then you have 2 sets of values that you're kind of looking toward. So I think hopefully that would provide a bit of consistency. I do have one question though. So the system-wide survey or comment process that you mentioned, would that be inclusive of student input?
The short answer is yes. We are looking for a process where anybody in our campus university community could weigh in on this as well. So the focused discussion with those groups that I mentioned in the presentation, but also an open comment period or a survey tool or a hybrid of the two to allow everyone the chance to weigh in.
Thank you.
Okay, and to wrap this discussion up, Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. I think this is a great discussion, and I don't think it's unrealistic to think that we could have a set of values that would apply to athletics and public health at the same time. I think that would be the goal, to come up with something that we don't have separate values in different departments, but have an overarching one that we can apply to everybody. It means it's more work that way, but I think it's important.
Okay. Well, Mr. Coomer, thank you so much for all your hard work on all of this, on the compliance, on the ethics. Lots of steps to be taken in the future, and lots of hard work has been done to get us this far. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Chair Cohen. Thank you, committee.
All right, Chief Auditor Klatt, a couple items left for you.
Indeed. So we have the information items that are included in your docket. Excuse me. Boyd, Mr. Coomer already mentioned the semi-annual Chief Compliance Officer report. In addition, there's the annual institution conflict of interest report that is required annually. So please look at that. There were no additional institutional conflict of interest issues that were identified through the work that the Office of Institutional Compliance does to monitor for those. Additionally, in the information item is the semi-annual controller's report, which you are all familiar with, and certainly has very good information about new issues in the finance area, as well as operational improvements and technology improvements that help the environment in which those people do their work. We have some engagements that require after the fact reporting that are listed in your docket material as well, and the Controller's Office looks at those for any potential conflict of interest with those providers and has determined that there were none. And lastly, the internal control policy underwent a comprehensive review, which I oversaw. I sent the policy out to folks within the institution who are actively engaged around it and are very familiar with its implementation and application throughout the university, and asked if they had any suggestions for enhancements or changes, and all of them said it was just absolutely perfect the way it was. Even better than Mary Poppins, who's only perfect in most ways. So the board office did do some minor formatting to make it consistent with other recent board policies, but there was no content changes. So with that, that concludes the information items.
Well, thank you, Auditor Klatt. Well, thanks, presenters, very much, and committee members for the marathon morning that we've had, and this being the second committee in that morning. Perfect. 3 minutes before lunchtime, and the meeting is adjourned.
All right. Good job.
I think they need